The 439th Troop Carrier Group participated in every airborne operation in the European theater during World War II. The 439th consisted of the 91st, 92nd, 93rd, and 94th Troop Carrier Squadrons. The focus of this presentation will be on key accomplishments of the 439th and their active involvement in 6 combat missions. Squadron codes were painted on the nose of every C-47 tow plane. The 439th Troop Carrier Group was under the umbrella of the 50th Troop Carrier Wing, 9th Troop Carrier Command. In February of 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Young was assigned as commanding officer of the 439th. Colonel Young's C-47 displayed the squadron code D8. On a bitter cold Sunday, the 13th of February 1944, the 439th Squadron's air echelon set out for England. They took the southern route starting at Morrison Field in Florida to Puerto Rico, to Trinidad, to Belém, Brazil, over the Atlantic to Ascension Island, then on to Dakar, finally arriving in French Morocco. After a period of rest, they flew out on a dark night, skirting the coast of Portugal, on to St. Mawgan, England. The embarkation date for the ground echelon, which included all the glider pilots, was on February 28th. They sailed from Camp Miles Standish on the SS George Washington for England. The 439th was stationed at RAF Airfield Balderston, England. Then, prior to June, they moved to Up Ottery Airfield in preparation for the Normandy invasion. After 3 months of rigorous training and combat simulations, the invasion of Normandy was imminent. The 439th glider pilots would be loaded with men and equipment from the 82nd Airborne Division. Following is a comprehensive overview showing where the 439th was placed among the serials flown in Operation Overlord, the code name for the air component. Excluding the Pathfinders, the 101st and 82nd Airborne Division's paratroopers made up the first 6 serials. Their route took them to the drop zones in the area around Sainte-Mère-Église on the Cotentin Peninsula. The airborne's objectives were to capture important bridges, causeways, and take out gun batteries to clear routes for the invasion forces to get off the beach and reach the interior. The airborne were also to secure glider landing zones William, Oboe, and Easy. On June 6, there were 2 glider missions in the early morning and 2 in the late evening. On the 7th of June, starting at 0700 hours, 4 final lifts departed for landing zone William. The movement order for 7 June began with the missions codenamed Galveston and Hackensack. Hackensack Serial 36 was flown by the 439th out of Airfield Up Ottery. This is a photo of the 439th in the briefing room on D-1. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Young briefed the men on the weather conditions for the missions. This is the early morning on June 7th. The 439th is preparing for Mission Hackensack. 439th glider pilots flew 30 British Horsa gliders and 20 USCG-4A gliders. Each squadron had elements of the 82nd Airborne. As an example, the load for the 94th was 2nd Battalion, 325th Glider Infantry Regiment. Their takeoff time was scheduled for 0647, and their flight time to the LZ would be a little over 2 hours. Many of these photos were taken by Flight Officer T. Bleecker Ripsum of the 94th. The 439th's 2-hour flight was flown in a standard 4-ship element, echelon to the right formation. This one is taken from Ripsum's glider from the pilot's seat as they passed over Portland Bill. In this photo, the formation is approaching the Cotentin Peninsula. All aircraft were marked with invasion stripes. The loopy coil around the tow rope is the communication cable. The following was recorded by 2nd Lieutenant Arthur Kaplan, historical officer for the 94th Squadron. Quote, "Even though the horses landed in bad shape, the crew and passengers suffered little in the line of major injuries. Our own CG-4As, meanwhile, landed intact in almost all cases." Our glider pilots joined the airborne columns, unloaded equipment, fought snipers, acted as perimeter guards, and escorted POWs back to the beaches, all without infantry training and without specific knowledge of what would be done or what should be done in their situation. They did all that was asked of them and more. They did it willingly and well. 2nd Lieutenant Kaplan. Get back as soon as possible was the final order given the glider pilots during their briefing. No formal evacuation was planned for the glider pilots. Many found cars and jeeps to get them back. Flight Officer Arnold Worston and Flight Officer Bleecker Ripsum were getting ready to make their trek to the beach when they came across this smashed-up glider with a perfectly good jeep. Worston appears to be saying to Ripsum, "It just needs a little work." 16 men from the 439th loaded onto the jeep and headed, by way of St. Mary-Glise, to Utah Beach. Once they got to the beachhead, the glider pilots were evacuated by LSTs to ships going back to England to be prepared to fly another combat mission. The 9th Troop Carrier Command made 2 changes in their operations following Normandy due to the casualty rate. One was that the American glider pilots were never to fly the Horsa gliders in combat again, and the other was not to land gliders in the dark. For the rest of the war, gliders went in during daylight hours. By July 16th, 6 weeks after Normandy, the 94th sent a cadre of C-47 pilots and glider pilots and some of their mechanics to Italy for the invasion of southern France under the command of the 12th Air Force. The 94th was stationed at Orbitello, Italy. There were troop carrier groups from 9 aerodromes along the coast of Italy, all close to Orbitello and down toward Rome. There were 11 glider serials in all. The 439th took off flying a route that took them over the tip of Corsica, which had an emergency landing area. Their destination was the area south of Dragoon. This shows the area for landing zone Obo. This is exactly what the glider pilots flying into Obo would see. Pathfinders marked the areas so both C-47 pilots dropping paratroopers and glider pilots could identify the landing zone. The letter O indicated the landing zone and the letter T the target. Besides the enemy, the glider pilots faced 2 major obstacles on this mission. The first was Rommel's asparagus. They had been briefed that they would be landing in and around vineyards, but found many of these fields also held 4-inch diameter poles, 12 to 15 feet high, with wire strung between them, ready to gut and destroy the gliders as they landed. Another hazard was the vineyards themselves, which contained vines that, while pruned short, had heavy, strong trunks that were much tougher than they anticipated. Again, after the 439th landed and the landing zones were secured, the glider pilots were to guard prisoners until they could evacuate to the beachhead. From there, they would be transported by ship to Corsica, where they would pick up a C-47 from their group back to Orbitello. Next was another turnaround mission, Holland, codenamed Market. Garden was the code name for the ground component. This operation is often referred to as a bridge too far. No sooner had the 439th gotten back from France on the 28th of August then they were again preparing for a combat mission. They were short glider pilots who had been wounded in southern France. So, to alleviate the problem, they flew with only one glider pilot. A ranking airborne was put in the co-pilot seat, and the pilot gave him a 5-minute briefing on how to fly and land the glider. Market was to be the largest lift of the war, slated to happen over a 3-day period. By liberating Holland, the Allies would get a foothold into Germany's Ruhr industrial area, and the 439th hoped to be home by Christmas. Market's glider missions began on September 17th. The 439th was back at Balderton for this operation. They led the glider mission in serial A28, which included all 4 squadrons. Their loads were elements of the 82nd Airborne. All 439th squadrons again lifted elements of the 82nd on the 18th in serial A36. Captain Henry Hobbs, 93rd Squadron glider officer, reported that his landing area had been well secured. His report stated, "I did not observe any fire while making the landing, but there were about 6 anti-aircraft gun emplacements, which appeared to be 88s, scattered within 200 yards from where I landed." The objective of the 82nd was to take this, the German-controlled Nijmegen Bridge. Again, the objective of the glider pilots was to return as soon as possible. The glider pilots' assembly area was a hunting lodge called Jagdslot Mugerheide. It was south of Nijmegen and north of Mook. From the hunting lodge, they were to catch the resupply trucks going back to Belgium and from there onto their bases. By September 19th, many of the 439th were still at the lodge, waiting for the resupply convoy when the weather changed. General James Gavin was told that he would not see his 325th Glider Infantry Regiment as expected. He was now short one entire regiment and had a bridge needing to be taken on schedule. General Gavin notified the glider pilots through their chain of command that they would be put on the line in place of the missing 325th. Here is a map marked up by the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment that shows 3 of the glider pilot positions on the evening of September 21st. Between the 20th and 21st, 300 glider pilots were put on the front line in foxholes with the 82nd. 145 were held in reserve. They stayed on the line until the 325th GIR relieved them on the 23rd. The glider pilots serving as infantry was a paradigm shift. It had become obvious that almost always in the first few hours of every combat mission they were fighting alongside the units that they took in. Captain Hobbs wrote, "I believe there would be less confusion if each glider pilot regiment stayed with their airborne unit until the time for evacuation arrived. The present arrangement, which gives glider pilots the latitude to do pretty much what they wanted, seems to produce great confusion." Shortly after the Holland operation, the 439th moved to Alençon, France. However, the mud was so bad they moved again on the 6th of November to their permanent home, Châteaudun Airfield, Station A39. After the Holland operation, the 9th Troop Carrier Command made a fundamental change to their doctrine and decided that the glider pilots were to participate as infantry. In the late fall of '44, the 17th Airborne Division, who were now in England, were tasked with the training responsibility. This training, however, was interrupted by a German counteroffensive in the Ardennes. The German counteroffensive began to materialize between December 16th and December 18th, 1944. The Ardennes offensive is better known as the Battle of the Bulge, and it became a nightmare for the 439th. The only glider combat resupply operation during the war was the resupplying of the beleaguered 101st Airborne at Bastogne. The operation included 3 glider missions. 2 were on December 26, with 1 glider lifting medical staff and surgeons because the 101st Hospital had been captured. The second mission was a 10-glider mission of 60 jerry cans of high-octane gasoline in each glider. These missions were assigned to the 440th Troop Carrier Group. Then, on the 27th, there was a 50-glider mission carrying mostly artillery ammunition. The 50 gliders in this mission were piloted exclusively by the 439th in squadron order 91st to 94th. These 5 glider pilots are waiting to fly in the 50 glider mission to Bastogne. All will be flying a glider without a co-pilot. The lift is from Châteaudun, France, where the 439th were now stationed, and the mission was codenamed Repulse. The situation in Bastogne was precarious, and, though never officially recorded, the mission planners were not optimistic that these glider pilots would be able to return to fly future missions. So, to minimize the potential loss of pilots, only 1 was put in each glider. This is Flight Officer Morris Albert Gann's glider number 3. Their takeoff was delayed until 1000 hours due to the frost on the tugs and gliders. You can see here that glider number 3 still has frost on the wings. As they approached the landing zone, Flight Officer Chuck Berry reported that the front of the formation was receiving intensive flak. This mission followed the same route as the 2 missions on the 26th. 18 of the 50 glider pilots never made it to the landing zone. 16 had either their tow plane shot down or the tow rope severed by flak before reaching the landing zone. Combat Order 1117 clearly shows where the German flak guns found their range. Of the 12 glider pilots from the 94th, 3 were killed and 8 were taken prisoner. As you can see, the 94th took the brunt of the enemy fire. Not one of the glider pilots from the 94th made it to the landing zone. Henry H. Newell, who evaded the Germans for days, was the only glider pilot from the 94th who was never captured. In some cases, the artillerymen of the 101st were completely out of rounds and were removing ammo directly from the gliders and loading their pieces. Those gliders that made it to the landing zone received a very warm welcome. The last glider combat operation of the war was the invasion of the German homeland, the Rhine Crossing. The airborne component was codenamed Varsity. The ground component was Plunder. It incorporated everything learned over the course of previous operations, but also included many firsts. 3 were significant. All gliders going into Landing Zone S would be on dual tow. The landing zones would not be secured the night before by paratroopers, and glider pilots, once landed, would be in an infantry role. Varsity would be the military equivalent of hitting the objective with a blunt instrument. The success was predicated entirely on simply overwhelming the enemy with superior numbers. This would be the largest single lift of the war, lifting 2 entire divisions, the British 6th and the American 17th Airborne. Everything, paratroopers, glider riders, their support field artillery, anti-aircraft, anti-tank batteries, medical facilities, signal corps, engineers, military police, would all drop directly on top of the enemy in overwhelming numbers between the towns of Hammenkell and Wesel, beginning at 1000 hours on March 24, 1945. The formation took 2 hours and 48 minutes to pass overhead. Multiple bombing missions, including one on the morning of the 24th, reduced the city of Wesel to rubble. These are the routes taken by the Allied Army Air Forces to Wesel, Germany. the 52nd Wing Groups north of Paris, the 50th Wing Groups south and east of Paris, the 53rd Wing Groups south and west of Paris, and the British 6th Airborne coming from England. On the Sunday morning of March 24th, 1945, at 12 airfields located throughout France, 985 aircraft, all assigned to the 53rd Wing, were preparing to fly men and equipment to the area of Wesel, Germany. 4 groups, the 435th, 436th, 437th, and the 439th, made history by flying on dual toes into Landing Zone S. Ripsum, in Chalk 98, photographed his companion short-tow glider, Chalk 97, and beyond is the long and short-tow next to them in the formation. As soon as the 439th C-47's tow planes and gliders crossed the Rhine, they were hit with heavy anti-aircraft fire. True to Axis Sally's promise, the flak was the heaviest any pilot had yet experienced. Several gliders were hit as they released from their tows and were destroyed before they landed. Many tugs were shot down. Other gliders were followed to the ground by fire from 20mm flak guns, machine guns, and small arms. Not a single glider would land without being hit, many with devastating wounds to pilots and the artillerymen they were carrying. The 439th would land near the northwest corner of Landing Zone S at Blumenkamp. Their loads were the 680th Glider Field Artillery Battalion. Once the gliders were on the ground, everyone on board became infantry. The fighting in both of the American landing zones, as well as the British landing zones farther north, was intense. This house is the intended 680th CP, chosen before takeoff. This house, next to the 680th, would become the 439th CP. Second Lieutenant Noel Addy, Chalk number 87, from the 435th Troop Carrier Group, landed in the 439th area of Blumenkamp. In Addy's post-mission report, he stated, "Before I stopped rolling, I started getting small arms fire from 4 or 5 houses surrounding the field. One of the artillerymen in his glider was critically wounded, and another glider that landed immediately after his was also taking fire, killing 3 artillerymen and severely wounding the pilot." Addy had had enough. He ordered an artilleryman to follow him, and they returned fire at the nearest house, then rushed it, taking 13 Volkssturm prisoners. Addy and his co-pilot then took 2 more regular German Army prisoners from another house. Addy further wrote, "At that time, the 439th Group landed in this immediate area with infantry and artillery and cleaned out the adjoining houses." Addy had spontaneously taken the role of platoon leader and had gotten the job done. The 680th Commander, Colonel Paul Oswald, directed a few high explosive rounds at the house that he desired as his CP and ended the resistance there. The 680th gun crews were scrambling to free their 105 howitzers from the gliders and get them loaded, all while under withering small arms, machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire. Normally used to lob their rounds in an arc, the artillery pieces were lowered and began to take the German batteries under direct fire at intimately close range. While the artillerymen were assembling their pieces in firing positions, Captain Henry Hobbs began organizing glider pilots of the 439th to begin some semblance of security around the immediate areas selected for the command posts, gun batteries, and aid station. As more gliders began to land, the Germans lowered their flak guns and began to target the now stationary gliders themselves. Flight Officer Chuck Berry and Flight Officer Carol Ray touched down and were bringing their glider to a stop. As they did so, Flight Officer Berry noticed the barrel of a German artillery piece swinging their direction. "Boys," he said, looking over his shoulder at the artillerymen in the jeep behind him, "I'm not your CO, but I suggest you get out of this glider now." The instant they cleared, a round smashed into the glider, destroying it and the Jeep. Originally, the 439th was intended to assemble and move south to provide security to the 681st GFAB. Instead, they became the sole infantry support for the 680th until 1800 hours. Late in the afternoon, on March 25th, all the glider pilots received orders to evacuate. The British troops that had crossed the Rhine the day before had broken through the German line and connected with the 17th Airborne. The 680th received the Distinguished Unit Citation for Varsity after World War II ended, which also recognized the 439th glider pilots. Lieutenant General Lewis H. Brereton, Commander, 1st Allied Airborne Army, had this to say about the glider pilots who flew into Germany. The conduct of the glider pilots in general is beyond written words of commendation. Not only did they deliver a magnificent and well-coordinated landing, which, in many cases, was in the midst of hostile positions, but were immediately engaged with their airborne associates in the hottest kind of hand-to-hand fighting. The discipline and command efficiency of these glider pilots has called forth the highest praise of division and regimental officers.